All right, this morning we're going to look at Isaiah, and we're going to be doing Isaiah's chapter 4 through 8 this morning. We didn't get quite all the way through it in the lesson in the class this morning, so you might hear some new things here. As we start to look here, you have to excuse me, my voice is a little scratchy. As we start to look at the first big chunk here as we go through Isaiah, we need to remember the predominant theme of what is going on in Isaiah, right? Then that predominant theme is judgment and hope for Jerusalem. Isaiah is going to begin chapters 1 and 2 with God promising to send the Gentile nations, these nations that are around them, as a purifying fire, as a judgment that is going to burn away everything that is worthless in Israel. And this is an important metaphor because we need to remember that as we come back to chapter 6 and the burning coal that touches Isaiah's lips. So this fiery judgment on Jerusalem burns away all the old and evil and worthless things, and it makes room for a new Jerusalem, a new kingdom, a new Jerusalem made up of people that have repented and turned back to God, people from every nation, Isaiah tells us. And that's when God's kingdom is going to come, right? When all the nations will come to this temple in the New Jerusalem, in those latter days, in the future days, and they learn of God's peace and God's justice. We talked about it last week, Acts chapter 2 and verse 17. Peter says that those days, and he's quoting from Joel, in the latter days, those days began when Christ came. That we are living in the last days or the latter days or the future days, however you want to translate that. And so here's a quick outline of what's going on here in the next few chapters. There's, like a lot in Isaiah, there seem to be a lot of semi-related things that are then transitioned between very frequently. So let's just keep going here. Chapter 4. We didn't go over that in the class, but we went over a little bit in the class. I want to talk about what it means that there is a remnant there. What's going on here? With chapter 4 here, Isaiah is going to bring to a close a section that he really began there in chapter 2, in verse 1. He started with this announcement of Israel's destiny, right, as the people of God through whom God's law would and could be made known through to this expectant world that is waiting to hear the message. But that vision is going to stand directly in contrast in the same chapter with the present condition of Israel. So in essence, she was reduced, Israel, all of Israel is reduced to just Judah and then just to Jerusalem. And even Judah and Jerusalem, instead of teaching the world, were being taught by the world, right? It says that they were shaking hands with the foreign nations, becoming like them. But Isaiah shows us in a series of these really astonishing contrasts how dependence on this human greatness does not exalt them, but rather will humiliate them. Instead of being taught by the world, instead of teaching the world, they were being taught by the world. They were learning dependence on human greatness in their life. But does this prediction and does this predicted destruction here mean that God is going to give up on Israel? That, in fact, her destiny will become unreachable? I mean, is that what's happening here? Is the promises of chapter 2 so far out that they can no longer reach them? Well, Isaiah chapter 4 here, and verses 2 through the rest of the chapter, verse 6, is going to answer that question. And it's going to answer it in the negative. It's going to say, no, it is still reachable. God will not give up on his people. And in fact, there's the fires of exile and the fires of wandering in the desert are going to come, but it's only going to serve to make his people more like what God wants them to be. And so he uses this Exodus imagery, right? In this case, the cloud is not just merely a pillar over the temple, but if we notice here, it's a cloud that covers all of Mount Zion and all the people that are assembled there. So instead of just this little pillar of cloud or pillar of fire over the one building, it's over the whole mountain. And the glory of the canopy of the cloud covers not just the temple, but now it belongs to all the people who worship the God of Zion. And let's use another example here to kind of prove that. If we go to Ezekiel chapter 39, Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 25. Therefore, says the Lord God, now I shall restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I shall be jealous for my holy name. And they shall forget their disgrace and all their treachery which they have perpetrated against me, when they live securely on their own land, with no one to make them afraid. When I bring them back from the peoples, and they gather them from the lands of their enemies, then I shall be sanctified through them in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. I am the Yahweh their God, because I made them go into exile among the nations, and then gathered them again through their own land. And I will leave none of them there any longer, and I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I shall be poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh God. So, the glory, which is this canopy here in chapter 4, now covers the entirety of the mountain, and it's now the possession of anybody who worships the God of Zion. The canopy of cloud and the fire is so terrifying to God's enemies, and it will be a source of comfort to those people who are the remnant here. The same fire which purged them is now their protection and their hope. And so the author here is saying that there is nothing in the created world here which can harm those who belong to God, not even death. Because some people have felt this mission. Some people have felt that the mention of the sun and the rain here in the poem is like somewhat mundane. And that this sort of offers a weak sort of conclusion to this story. But we need to remember, what did sun and rain represent to a pagan people? What did it represent? What was the pagan worldview about the natural forces? The pagan worldview of the natural forces is that deities are to be feared because they control the weather. They control your food supply through the amount of rain. But those who abide in the shadow of the Almighty God, Psalm 91, have nothing to fear from those principalities and powers of this world, those evil forces in this world. It's Ephesians 6, Ephesians 1, Romans 8. Paul talks about the principalities and powers. We have nothing to fear from them if we abide in the shadow of the Almighty. And that's what chapter 4 here is all about. Moving on to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is going to bring the sort of introduction to a close here. Chapters 1 through 5 here, sort of kind of bringing them to a close. If chapter 1 is sort of introducing the reader to the book as a whole, and chapters 2 through 4 sort of fillet open, and they lay bare the enormous conflict between Israel and what they were called to be, and it lays bare the fact that she was not those things. And it brings us back to the reality of Israel's condition at the moment that Isaiah is speaking here. There's much injustice and bloodshed and bribery and debauchery. Whatever the future might hold, however that redemption might happen, the plain fact was that somehow this present sin had to be dealt with. And so God gives another summary of where he's at. In verses 1 through 7, he gives the parable of the vineyard, right? And it sets the stage for the rest of this chapter, which is going to include a discussion of 6 conditions or the 6 woes that exist in the people of Israel, in the people of Judah, in the people of Jerusalem, and that they are contrary to God's expectation of them, right? That's the rest of this chapter. There is an announcement of destruction in verses 5 and 6 of the vineyard, and that's going to happen at the hand of Gentile armies. So Israel, who is the vineyard, it says in verse 7, is typified by Judah and Jerusalem. So he's saying Judah and Jerusalem is the Israel he's talking about. And now, O inhabitants of Judah, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, verse 3, judge between me and my vineyard, for my vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. So the men of Judah and Jerusalem are a plant inside of this vineyard. So you are part of the problem, Judah and Jerusalem, because the house of Israel, the whole vineyard, is set for destruction at the hand of Gentile armies because God has put in all the work. He has dug all the rocks out. He has taken all the weeds out. He has made a wall around the outside. He has planted a hedge. He has watered it. He has fed them. And what happens? The wild grapes or the sour grapes or the rotten grapes come up. So Israel is compared to a vineyard whose owner has given this great deal of care on them, only to discover that the vineyard does not produce good grapes. And similar to Nathan's method, remember Nathan the prophet, when he talks to King David and he confronts him, and he gets King David to condemn his own actions before he says that you are the man, David. Isaiah is going to set his hearers up for the same judgment. That God has cared for them like a vineyard, and yet the fruits of their lives are bitter and sour. Is not God more justified if he decides to remove that wall of protection from them, since he has He's done all these many things. So Isaiah is now going to specify what these wild grapes, these sour grapes are. The sour grapes are greed. Oh, I didn't list them. I'm sorry. The sour grapes are greed, verses 8 through 10, debauchery, 11 through 12, arrogance in 18 and 19, perversion in 20 and 21. They call evil good, and they call good evil. They substitute darkness for light and light for darkness. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Because if I just call this thing good, then it's no longer bad. That's the definition of what is happening right now in our society in what's called postmodernism. And postmodern is postmodern way of thinking, right? Because postmodernism, man, my tongue is tied today. Postmodernism says that there is no truth. Truth does not exist. Truth is only relative to what I make it and what society has decided is true. And so if society calls evil good, then that thing is good now. You can see how this can go down a road that is very, very bad. And so we can no longer judge individuals and by their actions. Hitler then is no longer wrong because there is no truth. They won't say those things. They will appeal to some natural standard, but then that's a standard that is outside of what we have determined as truth. And if there is no truth, then we can't have this standard. Again, let's get back to our Isaiah chapter 5. These wild grapes were producing sour fruit, greed, debauchery, arrogance, perversion, and injustice. And all of these are introduced by the word oi, as in oy vey, like I said during the class. And we translate this as, in English, as the word woe. This is one of those archaic English words that we don't have a good equivalent for in modern English. And the term is supposed to introduce us to a term of lament, of sorrow. It's not so much a threat here. It is a threat, but it's a term of sorrow. The prophet is not just angry at his people, and he's not just denouncing them and their activities. He's also afflicted by the grief of the sins of his people. They are tearing each other apart, literally and figuratively. And so the problem that Isaiah is addressing is the emergence of this wealthy, landed class of people that have turned their attention more and more to pleasure and indulgence and are then oppressing other people to make that wealth and indulgence grow even more. And so the state of the northern 10 tribes, the state of Israel, quote unquote, had experienced this same trend just 100 years earlier. They became very wealthy. They became very prosperous. And the prophet Amos prophesies about that, right? Amos lived about the same time as Isaiah. And around the world, people are driven by the desire to possess more and more, and then to spend what they possess on more lavish and more lavish things. And the ultimate result is that we're trying so hard to please ourselves that we find this emptiness because we ultimately can't find the pleasure in the things that we buy. And so Isaiah's response can be summed up by the words of another prophet here in Matthew, prophet Jesus. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Chapter 6 is called the Servanthood now. And so we see Isaiah in this great, crazy vision that he sees in the year of King Uzziah's death. So he wants to place this on the timeline so people know when it is. I saw the Lord, big L, little o. This is Adonai. I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, lofty and exalted, the train of his robe filling the temple. And so if chapters 1 through 5 are sort of this introduction, chapter 6 is now sort of a hinge that is going to allow the first section to fold back over into the rest of the book. So we see how these things are connected. Chapter 6 contains these words of just utter doom. But it also contains the words of the prophet's cleansing, right? And there's this hopeful note right at the end of chapter 6 that the holy seed is the stump or is in the stump. So immediately in chapter 7, we see the hardening impact that happens because of the words that come out of chapter 6 here. The words that Isaiah gives to the people are an invitation to trust Yahweh, the Yahweh God from chapter 6, who is so holy. In a real sense, sort of this destruction which comes to Judah from Assyria's hand in the very last years of the 8th century BC. If we look over at our map, Assyria the destruction that comes to Judah from Assyria's hand in the last years of the 8th century is caused by Ahaz's refusal of Isaiah's invitation, right? Isaiah's invitation in chapter 8 and verse 6. Isaiah says, "Inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah," the gently flowing waters. They have rejected these gently flowing waters of peace from God. And so what's going to happen? What is she doing? Is she okay? Is she okay? Oh, it's a snap. Okay, sorry. I thought she was breaking something. Sorry. They have rejected these gently flowing waters, and now the strong and raging waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria in all of his glory, will rise up over its channels and go over all its banks. Because they have rejected the gentle stream of God, the nation of Israel will be cut down like a field of stumps. Right? Chapter 16. There will be a 10th portion in it, and again, it will be subject to burning like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. Israel and Judah are going to be like a tree that's cut off. And then not only will it be cut off, but the stump will be burned also. But in one of those stumps, there's going to remain the evidence that God can be trusted. The holy seed is the stump there. And so the vision that Isaiah sees here in verses 1 through 8 gives us a clear idea of which is fundamental to the entirety of Isaiah's ministry. So we need to understand chapter 6 here and what's going on. It is this experience here in chapter 6 that explains Isaiah's contempt and just horror when he sees any kind of national or individual life which doesn't give God attention and praise. It causes him grief. It causes him terror and horror because he has seen the one true God who is holy, holy, holy. And so the reality of the experience for Isaiah and the truths which are conveyed to him through this vision here are very fundamental in significance in informing who Isaiah is. Precisely how or where this vision occurred is not really pertinent to the discussion. Was it a dream? Was it heaven? Was it the temple? Well, what matters is that he saw God, and he saw him in such a way that it changed and shaped the rest of his life. So the center of this first section here of Isaiah, of chapters 1 through 12, if we call that the first section, we have this 1 through 5 is sort of the introduction. Chapter 6 is this hinge that then connects it to the rest of the book, that God is sitting on his throne here in chapter 6. And that somehow that throne reaches from heaven above to the temple here on earth. And Isaiah sees these mighty creatures that are continually shouting, "Holy, holy, holy." And it leads Isaiah to realize just how corrupt he himself is and how corrupt Israel is. You see, Isaiah is sure that he's going to be destroyed by God's holiness as he's in the presence of it. But he's not. God's holiness also contains a saving grace. God chooses to give to Isaiah a form of forgiveness, a form that comes in the form of a coal, a red-hot coal, to burn Isaiah, but not to destroy him. It purifies him from his sin. And now that he is pure, he can accept the mission of God, and God tasks him with this huge task, right? To keep telling the message of judgment by fire that is going to come to the people of Israel. That Israel has reached this point of no return, that they're already there. And Isaiah's warnings are going to have this paradoxical effect, like the parables of Jesus. It's one of those other P words, I forgot. That it's going to have this paradoxical effect. Instead of changing people's hearts to come to God, it's going to harden their hearts. Just like the parables of Jesus had their effect on the rulers of Jerusalem. Still, though, even through all of that, Isaiah must trust God. Even when Israel is chopped down like a tree, and even when the stump of Israel is burned, that smoldering stump still has a holy seed that will survive into the future. That's the message of chapter 6. Chapters 7 through 8 now have several different prophecies in them. And it's in my mind, chapters 7 through 8 are now answering the question, who or what is that seed? The other chapters here in this section of 7 through 12 offer an answer to that question. They're mostly about a specific situation in history. See, we have been doing a lot of poetry. Now suddenly we come up on this narrative section. So Isaiah is telling the story of what's going to happen now with Ahaz. So these chapters here deal with Ahaz, who is a descendant of David. He is of the line of David. He is the king of Jerusalem. And Isaiah announces the downfall of Ahaz, right? Isaiah says that it will be Assyria that will first chop down and devastate the land, but that there's hope. See, we need to remember, God made a promise to David, right? That this new king from David's line would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And what's more is these chapters deal with a specific, very specific theological problem. They deal with a problem, and that problem is, why should I trust God? So you see, the focus of these chapters 7 through 12 is on God's trustworthiness and his capacity to save those people who would trust in him through his promised leader, who will be called Emmanuel. They will all be brought into the New Jerusalem. All these believers in Emmanuel will be brought into this New Jerusalem, and they will be set free from these violent, oppressive empires like Israel, like Assyria, like everyone around them. And so there's a theological connection here between the condemnation of trust in the nations, right? Because that was Israel's problem. They were trusting in the nations, but they would be judged by the nations. They would be taken into captivity by the nations. But they would be delivered from the nations. And there would be an announcement of doom onto the nations, which is the next section that we'll look at, not next week, but 2 or 3 weeks from now, chapters 13 through 23, which is judgment on the nations. So, how do we kind of conclude this then? How do we wrap all these things up? Isaiah is going to go on in chapter 11 to describe this seed. He's going to describe the seed as a small new shoot of growth that's going to emerge from the old burnt stump of David's family, right? And it's a seed that is the king, or it's a king that is the seed from chapter 6. And this king is going to be empowered by God's Spirit to rule over this new Jerusalem and bring justice to the poor and bring justice to all nations. And all nations will look to this messianic king for guidance. And his kingdom will transform all of creation and bring peace. And I am here to tell you this morning that that kingdom has come. Acts chapter 2 and verse 15. When Peter starts his sermon, he starts his sermon telling about this last days. A lot of Bibles translate it last days. Some say latter days, some say future days. Peter says, these men are not drunk as you suppose. Why did people think they were drunk? Because they had the Spirit of the Lord working through them, speaking in other languages so that people who were there from those other places could hear what they were saying. They thought they were drunk. Peter says that these people aren't drunk, but this is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth of my Spirit upon all mankind. And your sons and daughters shall prophesy, and your young men will see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. If you skip down, I will in those days pour forth my Spirit. The Spirit of the Lord has come on his people. And Peter says that it was happening in those days. His kingdom has come to transform this world. And so my question is this morning, forget about the world scale. Have you allowed God's kingdom to transform you? Have you allowed the rule of God to transform your life? Because if you're willing to rely on God, then you can free yourself from the sin and the entangling evil, the iniquity of this world that is all around us. In a world where there's mass shootings, in a world where things just don't make sense anymore, you can be freed from those things. You can be freed from those burdens if you will submit yourself to the King. The way you do that is by first recognizing that he is the king. If you're willing this morning to say that Jesus is the king, and you're willing to make a change in your life, to say, I'm going to turn my life. I'm going to turn my life 180 degrees, and instead of running away from the king, I'm going to run towards the king and his kingdom. If you're ready to make that decision, we can help you make with that pathway in life. And I ask you to come, please find me. Call the phone number here at the church. Send us an email, sitkachurch@gmail.com. Whatever it is, if you're ready to make that decision, we can help you. Because after you've made that decision, you need to have your sins washed away. If you're ready to make that decision this morning, please come and let us know, and we can help you with those things. That's the lesson for this week from Isaiah chapters 4 through 8. Next week, we'll be looking at 9 through 12. Chapters 9 through 12. We might back up and hit 8 again, but that's the lesson for this morning. Have a good day, everyone.